Hi, everyone. Today we're talking about the value that working internationally can bring to your actuarial career. And joining us for this discussion is experienced actuary and truly global actuary, Mark Baxter. For the past 40 years, Mark's had an extensive global career as a C-suite executive and director in financial services in Sydney, Hong Kong, London, and Cape Town, with his main specialty being in strategic risk management and developing and leading large, complex, and diverse teams. Named as one of Australia's top 50 LGBTQ role models by Deloitte and Google in 2018, Mark acknowledges that in all the C-suites and boards on which he's served, he's always been, in his words, the only gay in the village, with all the baggage that includes. He's keen to see talented people from underrepresented groups being included in the highest levels of corporate Australia. And being orphaned in his teenage years and from a working class background, Mark developed a strong community focus and has supported several not-for-profit and arts organisations both here in and overseas. Mark's also mentored several LGBTQIA students in developing their careers, and he currently serves as a non-executive director and is also a qualified personal trainer and group fitness instructor. Wow, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. I know there's so much that we could talk about because you have had such a diverse career and you have been involved in so many important causes. And I know many actuaries know you for your important work, trailblazing really in the LGBTQ space. And I know we could probably talk about that a lot, but we're not going to, because I know you've talked about that on some other podcasts, and we'll include links to that in the show notes. But instead, we're talking today about your global actuarial career and what you've learned from that. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Julia. Great to see you. I think I just heard my email beep, so I'll turn that off. Yeah, thanks. I really enjoy doing this today. So,
yeah,
and
wonderful.
It's great to talk about the international career rather than the LGBT stuff for something a bit different.
Yeah, both so important and so many insights that you've got from that experience. So, Mark, you have had a truly global actuarial career. How did that come about?
Well, funnily enough, it was kind of a deal between me and my partner at the time, Sally. She was a book editor in Sydney and really was desperate to get to London. And because that's seen as sort of the centre of sort of Western or Commonwealth book publishing. But I was doing my fellowship exams. So the deal was, when I finished the fellowship exams, that we actually take off to London.
Right.
And it was a complete blast. It was in the late 80s when the London markets were actually opening up. And I ended up at KPMG in their very new actuarial services division at the time. Australia hadn't even set up then.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was pre-Australia, Australia KPMG. And it was just a blast. It was just an absolute blast. You know, we did the year-long backpacking and then landed in London with no money. And Sally ended up with a great career in publishing. And I ended up sort of probably getting a taste for travel and a taste for sort of getting into different environments, and that kind of meant that I just got the travel bug.
Wow.
Yeah.
Bitten by the travel bug after making a deal with Sally to go to London after your exams. Okay.
Right. That's right.
That sounds very, very exciting and like a very exciting time as well. Mark, can you tell us about your first international leadership role and what you learned from that?
Yeah, I returned from London and sort of settled down at Mercer, interestingly. And I still actually remember, and I was still only 29, and I still remember sort of getting into the office early one morning, a beautiful Sydney day. The phone rings at sort of about 8 or 8:30, which I was surprised it was an early call. And it was the chief executive of Asia Pacific. And he just said, "Oh, Mark, you've been traveling around," because I happened to have met him in London before I got back to Australia. And he said, "Oh, you're used to international experience. How would you like to lead the Hong Kong office?"
Wow.
And I went, "Really?"
It was a surprise. You
It
weren't
was very much
expecting
a
that kind of
surprise.
offer.
Yeah, it was completely out of the blue, and I hadn't
Mm.
really thought about it. And it was back in '93, actually, I think. And so I went and had a bit of a recce,
Yep.
a couple of weeks in Hong Kong to see what the office was like. And to be frank, it was a bit of a mess.
Was
Uh,
it?
yeah, and then ended up accepting the role. I initially came back and said no.
Did you?
Yeah, and then my boss at the time thought I was a hard bargainer, so I was actually being sincere. I wasn't negotiating, but in the end, I couldn't say no, and
Wow.
ended up in Hong Kong in '93. Um,
So it was a tough choice for you to take that opportunity. You said no to start with, and you really meant it.
Yeah, because initially, hopefully I was self-aware at the time because I was 29, and it meant that I would be the youngest office head in
Mm,
Mercer.
mm,
And I thought it was a bit daunting to go to an office which was only 20 people, losing a lot of money, and needed rebuilding. And I thought, really?
mm.
Uh, and
Felt
so,
felt
so
like too much of a challenge, or felt like
yeah,
something you
yeah.
didn't feel ready for?
It felt a bit daunting.
Mm.
Finally, I ended up going for it. And in the end, I thought, well, things can't get worse. You know, so,
So it was daunting, and there was some negotiation to get you over there, and you agreed to it in the end. What was it like? What did you learn from that experience working in Hong Kong?
well, it was a combination of a couple of things. It was, everything felt alien when you got there. There was quite a few things that felt similar because of being an
Mm,
English colony at the time.
mm,
But apart from that, getting used to sort of Hong Kong Chinese culture and stuff like that. So everything was really quite different. The office, of course, was bilingual. It was both
mhm,
Cantonese and English.
mm.
I quickly learnt some Cantonese. You often end up learning the what would you say, the less polite
The
Cantonese.
colourful
Colourful
language.
Cantonese.
Yep,
um,
important words.
yeah, and really had to learn about, you know, what people thought of hierarchy, getting used to the culture, learning about how expats actually fitted in, and the nature of expats and so forth. And I've got to say I was actually really lucky. I was actually given a very good Chinese name,
Mhm.
which was great, which actually confused people because it seemed like a traditional Chinese name,
Okay.
even though I was a white person or am a white person.
Mm,
Um, and um, and I didn't realize too the nickname in the office is very important,
okay.
and it sometimes makes fun of the expats or is almost respectful. And I was actually called Dai, which I'm not getting the tone right now, but it actually referred to Big Brother was actually
Okay.
the loose translation, but
Nice.
it was also a character in a very famous Cantonese film
Mm,
in Hong Kong, almost a gangster-like person. So I wasn't quite sure of what the nickname actually meant.
mm,
Um, but it was kind of like I had to be resilient because the office was losing money, and I had to quickly learn how to actually develop clients really quickly, or even get clients confident that Mercer wouldn't let them down because
mm,
we were by far the smallest consultant in Hong Kong.
mm.
The main one was Watson Wyatt that had most of the business.
So
And
how did you do that, Mark? I mean, you were there. You're a white man in a young white man in a different country. How did you build rapport and build that trust?
well, the interesting thing is, I was really lucky because for some strange reason, I was actually able to pick up Cantonese relatively quickly.
Not just the swear words.
No, not just the swear words. And I could actually have small talk with prospects
Right.
and clients. Not much more. Once you go
Mm,
to business, it was all in English.
mm,
And I actually manned the phones, knocked on doors, and I was
mhm,
at the time, like a lot of actuaries, I think I was pretty introverted, but I had to just get out there and
mm,
get over those sort of issues with being introverted and not not be scared of rejection.
Mm.
And we started running conferences. We started doing things a little bit differently. I think too, I was lucky with timing because there was a real move to defined contribution plans
Mm-hmm.
at the time, and I really pushed that as part of what Mercer could do,
Mm-hmm.
and set up the investment consulting division there, and set up an admin division as well. The business grew after 6 years to about 140 people and making lots of money. And,
Wow.
I jokingly said, I did 6 years of a 2-year contract
Right.
by the time I returned home. But I returned home in December 1999
Mm.
because I wanted to celebrate the millennium with friends and be in Australia for the Olympics.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, and I thought I was coming back to Australia to live, but permanently, but that wasn't to be.
That wasn't to be. So it sounds like the Hong Kong experience was amazing for your career, even though you weren't quite sure whether you were ready for that challenge. You really embraced it and learnt a lot from it.
Yeah, it was. Look, I made an enormous number of mistakes along the way, and I kind of had to adapt a bit. And I look back at myself, and at times I possibly felt as if I was a legend in my own lunchbox, and sort of but I really, really learnt a lot, and it was fascinating, and it was actually. The big thing was about being dropped in an environment that you know nothing about, and actually working out how you can actually quickly learn about that environment, and actually learning that for a lot of things in different countries. I think I'm stating the obvious. People they do things in quite different ways. Nothing is actually wrong. So it's actually trying to understand where that has actually come from, and why that's being done, and not approaching things with the attitude that must be wrong because we do this in Australia this way.
Right. Being open-minded to different ways. Yeah.
Different ways of doing things, and it's just it was fascinating actually. And then I went to the UK for a while.
So tell us about that, because after Hong Kong, you didn't just come back to Sydney and stay here. You've since had extensive global leadership experience. What was that like, and what was how did you navigate those challenges of managing different people in different countries with different cultures? How did you do that?
Yeah, look, it was interesting because probably one of my I took a big role at Old Mutual. I was the global chief actuary and the deputy chief risk officer for Old Mutual, based in London. But Old Mutual at the time had Scandia, which was all the Scandinavian countries. It had Europe. We had an American division, and of course we had South Africa and Zimbabwe and so forth. And I effectively ran the entire actuarial division across the globe.
Wow.
So it was about 500 people. So you had all the Scandies, you had all the Europeans, you had the South Africans, you had a lot of Americans. And so forth.
Such a diverse team, and all with their different cultures and ways of working and ways of living, and all their differences.
Very much. And when I landed at Old Mutual, the UK was actually in the throes of implementing Solvency II. And that meant the entire global actuarial network really had to come together in a massive project to actually be able to do the appropriate valuations and reporting for Solvency II.
Wow.
One thing that I felt strange about, because I'd actually moved on from actuarial work, but being the global chief actuary for Old Mutual, I ended up being caught up in a lot of traditional stuff again. But Solvency II was fascinating. But I had to get people working together. So eventually, not eventually, but relatively quickly, I did a huge conference down in Cape Town for the actuarial division. And I made it a bit different in that people were a bit skeptical to start with, in that I had a whole day where we did a piece of charity work out in one of the townships.
Tell us about that.
And we were basically painting a childcare centre, and it was both rewarding and a bit sad and fascinating, because the childcare centre was only made for about 20 students, but there was often 80 there every day.
Wow.
And because of HIV, it had actually ravaged the African continent, and a lot of people were being looked after by older siblings, or people didn't have parents, their grandparents. So there were kind of all these broken families.
Yeah.
And we were there just painting the childcare centre. But it was a really great way of actually getting conversations going, because when I was sitting in London, I used to hear that the people in South Africa would complain about the people in London, and
Right.
the Europeans would complain about the people in London, and the Scandinavians would complain about the South Africans, and whatever.
Yeah. That's sort of us and them type mentality, that
Yep.
they're different, and there's we're not the same, we're not on the same page.
Yeah, but getting a heap of us at a conference, painting a childcare centre, particularly with that background of the people at the childcare centre, and the woman who ran it was a saint. She was a complete saint. People had an opportunity to just have those conversations. It wasn't this, snatch conversations between technical sessions. It was literally we actually were there for about 10 or 12 hours. We painted the entire thing.
Wow.
It really bonded the team. It was really interesting. Stuff like that. It's really get a good purpose, and people start coalescing under it, and they start getting comfortable about talking about issues that they might have, frustrations they might have, and it's about getting people to talk and actually having real conversations. And I purposefully made that the first day, and then the next 2 days, the conference was an enormous success.
Right.
It was just fantastic, and we got an enormous amount of things done, and in the end, Old Mutual got their Solvency II approval, and we got a whole heap of stuff done, and we had some really interesting off the wall external speakers as well, not necessarily technical sessions. We had some futurists and stuff like that to make it a bit interesting. So it was probably maybe not dissimilar to the World Congress, because we had something like 300 actuaries there.
I think that's such an interesting point that you've made, though, Mark. It's when you've got people from different places coming together, if you can have that kind of leveling type activity that's sort of not about technical, and it's not about us and them, it's about just connecting on a human level with a shared purpose.
Exactly.
How powerful that can be, and how powerful that can be to break down barriers and to, bring teams together. I think that's a fantastic example that you've shared. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great, actually. And look, I chose, for budget reasons, I chose Cape Town because most of the people were participating from Cape Town.
Right. So you're still practical, being practical.
But the nice thing was, even the actuaries who were based in Cape Town or Joburg, had not really been amongst the townships too much, and they found it fascinating themselves to come to a township. So it was really interesting.
It sounds like it, and I imagine that's even quite applicable today in this post-pandemic world, where people aren't even in the office in the same organisation, in the same city so much anymore. So, the benefit of that, getting people together, is quite powerful.
That is.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, Mark, it sounds like your global roles have provided you with some really great perspectives and some very unique expertise and unique opportunities. How valuable was that new toolkit when you came back to Australia?
Look, it's an interesting one. On a personal level, I have found it incredibly valuable. It sort of has changed my outlook on life, changed my outlook on work, stuff like that. At times, I think international experience is actually undervalued in Australia, and it's not. And it's not just with actuarial or risk people. I think more broadly, there's an expat group called Advance, which is trying to promote returning expats and Australian expertise globally. A common refrain is, "Oh, you've been offshore a long time. You don't have too much Australian experience."
Okay. Undervalued because not for what you can bring, but because of what you might have missed out on from not being here.
Yeah, there's a perception at times that the way Australians do things is different, but
Mm,
it's not really. It kind of is fascinating. But having said that, you know, the global experience, I've got this great global network of people, and we often reach out to each other, and help with things, and it's really nice to bounce things off. I've got a very old friend. She's the chief risk officer. She used to work in my team, and I'm really proud that she's become the chief risk officer of a major insurer in the UK. She still calls me boss, which annoys the hell out of me. Um, but um, she every now and then will just WhatsApp me and ask me a few questions, and I'll do the same back. And
Yeah.
it's really nice having that. People with different lived experiences will actually approach things in a different way, and I think that's a really powerful way of actually getting good results.
Good
And
diversity of thought.
yeah, and so it is around, diversity of thought, but I do find at times in Australia, sometimes there isn't that openness to broad things. If you look at one example I have, you look at one of the major banks, they say they've done a global search, but they end up appointing an Australian. So
Right.
you kind of think, really?
Did you really?
Yeah.
Was it really global? Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, it's but on a personal level, it's been just an absolutely sensational thing. And I feel as if in the workplaces, I've actually learnt an enormous amount. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I've also learnt an enormous amount as well in the way people approach things, in just dealing with diverse groups of people as
Yeah.
well. I use the example when I was on the Exco at Prue in London. We had a female South African chief executive who I adore.
Mm.
Uh, we had a Muslim CFO. We had a Hindu chief marketing officer. We had a gay Australian CRO, and
Yeah.
the whole gamut of things around the table.
Yeah.
And I just really love that diversity. Whereas often you'll actually find, unfortunately, in Australia, you look around the table and everybody's white and middle class, and with very similar lived experiences often. And I think I really enjoyed the diversity offshore. Even in South Africa, when I was on the board of a major general insurer, we South Africa had this thing called Black Employee Empowerment, which is very much about, because of the past apartheid, it was actually about promoting the people from the Black community and trying to educate people and have people come forward, and so of course we had and South African, everyone's called Black, so I'm not being pejorative. And we had Black directors that came with their own perspectives to the table, which was actually fascinating. And we're always talking about how do we actually empower these people who had been downtrodden for so long. And so it's going to take generations to fix, but it was really interesting dealing with those issues.
So I'm curious to hear what you think about this, and having listened to your experience, you've had those kind of more homogenous, everybody looks the same, everybody's got the same kind of worldview type situations, and then you've had some very diverse experiences where you've got people with different religions, cultures, backgrounds, different ways of thinking. What do you think is the key difference between having diversity or having more of a homogenous group in making decisions? What have you seen? What have you noticed?
Look, it's just it often sounds like a cliche, but it is that diversity of thought. Because if a problem's kind of presented, people will actually approach it in quite different ways, and things that in ways that you may not have actually thought of. And I think that means you actually get to a better solution. I think too, using my Prudential example, for example, if there was a diversity discussion, everybody would pitch in. Everybody would have a really good conversation about it based on their own experience. Often I've been on excos in Australia as being the only gay in the village. If there's a diversity discussion about LGBT, everybody just looks at me,
Right.
and there isn't sort of this kind of respectful and almost challenging at times conversation, because I think conversations do have to be challenging in order to get better solutions. There is a danger when you have a homogenous group that nobody wants to offend each other,
Right.
and they avoid the challenging conversations.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, so I feel as if internationally I've actually come across that a lot more than I have in Australia, which I miss a bit.
Okay. So it sounds like there's power in that diversity of thought. So I'm also curious to explore when we're working as actuaries with non-actuaries, because you've held senior roles in large companies where you've had to work with non-actuaries. How's your global experience helped you in those situations?
Look, it's interesting, and if you don't mind me saying, I think it was from my time in Hong Kong. I backed off from using the term non-actuaries.
Ah,
Um,
why is that?
and I tend to use the word other professionals.
Other professionals. Okay. Is there
Because
a reason why non-actuary? I mean, not, yeah. Use
it,
non-actuaries a lot.
I've probably always been slightly uncomfortable when
Mm,
actuaries use the term non-actuaries, because it
mm.
almost implies a superiority. You're,
Ah,
you're a non-actuary, therefore
right.
you're better. And so it might be me being a bit of a pedant, but
I think that's a really good point.
I prefer to talk about being a professional,
Mm,
and
mm.
and working with other professionals, because I've been talking about diversity of background, but in the UK, when I was the CRO of the Pru, I had lawyers, I had accountants, I had operational risk specialists, I had culture people, and I had actuaries. But I
Yep.
wouldn't say I've got actuaries and
And
non-actuaries.
non-actuaries. And I guess when I think about it too, it makes sense when you say that non-actuaries could be, we're suggesting that they're not as good as actuaries in some way. And I guess also it's sort of making an assumption that anyone who's not an actuary fits into the same bucket called non-actuary, which isn't really true either. So, yeah, interesting terminology. Thanks, Mark.
That's
So,
okay.
so when you've been working with other professionals, actuaries and other professionals, how's your global experience helped you in those situations?
Look, I think it's actually getting back, and I feel as if I'm sounding like a scratch record. It's just that sort of openness and inquiring mind and that curiosity,
Mm,
in terms of trying to understand where the other person's coming from. Really getting that really challenging and constructive conversation
mhm,
going, to actually get to better solutions. And some people find that a little bit challenging, but I think that's where the global experience has actually really helped me, because I'm always just generally interested in where people are coming from,
mm.
um, and I do think that actually just gets better solutions.
Yep. Sounds like that global experience has really given you some great tools and perspective to be able to navigate those more diverse conversations here in Australia as well.
Well, I hope so. And the
Mm,
other thing is just really just the exposure to other cultures as well, and traveling. I used to go to chief actuaries conferences in Europe, and you'd actually have people from all over Europe with their own perspectives and from their different markets and so forth, and that they were just sensational. I remember
mm.
speaking at one in Istanbul, and the people came, even though it was all just actuaries, they all came from different perspectives on how things should be solved.
Mm, mm.
Fascinating.
So many dimensions of what makes us human, so many
Yeah,
different
exactly.
characteristics. And as you say, if you can harness that diversity of thought, that can be really powerful for
Very much.
different perspectives and different decisions on things. So
Very much.
excellent. Mark, thank you for sharing all of your stories and anecdotes and experience with us today. I'd like to leave with one final question, and it's this. What's one piece of advice that you'd give to actuaries considering whether to pursue a role overseas?
Well, I think I'm going to sound like a sportswear manufacturer, because it's going to be just do it.
Just go for it.
Just do it. the thing is that, you know, yeah, it just opens up your life, or it has actually opened up my life. I've been really, really lucky with all the travel, and it's just been absolutely fascinating. And I think it's sort of just an exciting thing to do. So just do it.
Just do it. Great advice. Thanks so much, Mark. It's been wonderful talking to you on We Are Actuaries today.
I really appreciate it, Julia. Thanks so much for having me.